Welcome to the annual Jonathan Netanyahu Endowment Lecture, The Dreyfus Affair, Anti-Semitism and the Transformation of Jewish Identity at the Turn of the 20th Century with Maurice Samuels. I'm Ben Lorch. I'm a professor here in James Madison College and affiliated faculty with the Serling Institute. Before we get started, I'd like to begin by thanking our generous donor, Lauren Harris, for making this evening possible, and the Jonathan Netanyahu Fund for the Study of Jewish People and Anti-Semitism. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors, the College of Arts and Letters, James Madison College, the College of Social Science, the Residential College of Arts and Humanities, the International Studies Program, the Center of European and Eurasian Studies, and the Department of History. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Maurice Samuels. Maurice Samuels is the Betty Jane Anlyan Professor of French at Yale University, where he also directs the Yale Program for the Study of Antisemitism. He's the author of 5 books on 19th century French literature and culture, with a special focus on French Jewish history. His latest book is Alfred Dreyfus, The Man at the Center of the Affair. It was published by Yale University Press in 2024 in the Jewish Lives series. I've been looking forward to this lecture since I read Dr. Samuels' book last summer. This is an amazing story. It tells the story of a country that is a liberal democracy, well established, where Jewish people have been integrated with full civil rights as members of society for 100 years. And all of a sudden, seemingly, the country erupts in a public outburst of anti-Semitism across the country, which takes everybody by surprise. And Jewish people in France are really forced all of a sudden to think in a fundamental way about what is their situation in this country in ways they might have taken for granted up until then. This is the story that Dr. Samuels tells, and I'm looking forward very much to his talk, so please go ahead.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for this nice invitation. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you to Michelle for coordinating everything so well. And I'm excited to talk to you about Dreyfus and to hear your questions after. So in 1894, a Jewish officer in the French army named Alfred Dreyfus was accused of selling military secrets to Germany. Tried and found guilty based on trumped-up evidence in a hasty court-martial, he was shipped off to Devil's Island, a remote penal colony off the coast of French Guiana, and began serving a life sentence under unbelievably brutal conditions. Meanwhile, back in France, his devoted wife and brother launched a campaign to prove his innocence that wound up dividing the French nation and riveting the world. The Dreyfus Affair, as the case came to be known, plunged France into crisis because it raised fundamental questions about the nature of liberal democracy, the form of government that guaranteed rights to the individual through the rule of law. And that's what Ben was just referring to a minute ago. So the case raised these questions at a moment when liberal values were triumphing throughout much of the world, but also when the seeds of anti-liberalism were being planted in many of the same nations that had pioneered political freedom. On its face, the affair asked whether individual citizens could claim the right to impartial justice even when this right conflicted with military or national interest. On a deeper level, it asked whether religious and racial minorities belonged in the nation at all. Now, scholars have thoroughly explored the ins and outs of Dreyfus's legal case, as well as dozens of other topics related to the affair. I think I say in the book, and I got this from someplace else, that after the French Revolution, the Dreyfus Affair is the it's the next most written about event in French history. So there's an enormous number of books and articles about the case. These books have shown how the case widened divisions between the left and the right in France, led to the separation of church and state, witnessed the first interventions by intellectuals in political matters, and even changed social and gender relations in lasting ways. Surprisingly, though, the specifically Jewish dimension of the affair has received relatively little attention. This hesitation dates to the early days of the affair itself, when Dreyfus's family and other supporters, many of whom were Jews, sought to broaden their coalition by emphasizing the universal values at the core of the case: truth, justice, the rule of law, rather than the supposedly narrow issue of anti-Semitism. They also wanted to avoid seeming to support Dreyfus merely out of sectarian impulses, and to give the lie to accusations by anti-Semites that Dreyfus was being defended by a powerful Jewish syndicate. And ever since, scholars, especially in France, have shared this tendency to universalize the affair, to minimize the Jewishness of the affair. And when I say that, I don't mean that scholars don't mention the fact that Dreyfus was Jewish. Every book about the Dreyfus Affair mentions that Dreyfus was Jewish. But what I mean is that they don't focus on Jewishness. They don't make Jewishness the central focus of their work on the case. Most scholars also treat the issue of anti-Semitism only tangentially, and some even go as far as to deny its importance to the case. So in contrast, my recently published biography of Dreyfus argues that his Jewishness was central to every aspect of the case, from why he was accused to why the case became an affair. And in my talk today, I'll lay out my reasoning, focusing primarily on the issue of anti-Semitism. I'll conclude by examining the effect that the Dreyfus Affair had on Jews around the world, showing how it laid the groundwork for the emergence of a modern form of Jewish identity conceived in response to anti-Semitism. First, some background on Dreyfus himself and on the affair that bears his name. So forgive me if you know a lot about the case, but I'm assuming not everyone has it front of mind. So I'll give you some key background details. So Alfred Dreyfus was born in 1859 in Mulhouse. It's marked there in red, in the French province of Alsace, near the border with Switzerland, so in the far eastern part of France. And that's near Switzerland and Germany, and that's where in the 19th century most of the Ashkenazic Jews in France lived. Thanks to the French Revolution, when France became the first European nation to grant Jews full civil rights in 1790 and 91, French Jews had become the best integrated Jews in the world by the middle of the 19th century. And the rise of the Dreyfus family typifies this success. So Alfred's father, Raphael Dreyfus, started out as a peddler of cloth in Mulhouse, which was a capital of textile manufacturing. And in the 1860s, he took advantage of the disruption in the textile trade caused by the American Civil War to launch his own factory. Within a few years, he became a wealthy industrialist. Alfred and his 6 siblings were raised in a mansion with servants in the center of town. Whereas many residents of Alsace spoke German and the Jews spoke Yiddish, a dialect of German, the Protestant elite of Mulhouse was mainly Francophone, and Raphael wanted to imitate them, so he decided to raise his 2 youngest children, Alfred and his next oldest brother Mathieu, in French. They attended French schools and became ardent French patriots. Actually, in the book, I spent a little bit of time trying to read this image of the dad. And I think it tells us some key things about what kind of Jews they were. So if you notice, he has a top hat on his lap. So the top hat signifies various things. I think first it's a sign of his upper class identity or his pretensions to being a bourgeois, a middle or upper middle class person. But unlike a religious Jew, his head is uncovered. So if he were really Orthodox, he would be wearing the hat. So the fact that he has it on his lap is also signifying, I think, that he is a modern Jew who's not, he's nominally Orthodox, like all French Jews were at the time, but he's sort of signaling that he's not so observant. So Alfred's happy childhood came to an end with the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, when Prussian troops occupied his hometown. So for those of you who don't remember the Franco-Prussian War, France got kind of dragged into this war by Bismarck. It was a total disaster for the French. They lost very quickly, and especially the eastern provinces of France were overrun by the Germans, and in fact Germany unified right after the Franco-Prussian War, became Germany, and France would be forced to cede the eastern provinces of Alsace and Lorraine to Germany, which nourished a militaristic cult of revenge in France that lasted until World War I, when France, of course, finally regained its lost provinces. Like many Alsatian Jews, the Dreyfuses opted for French citizenship in 1870. They had the choice, everyone in Alsace had the choice whether they wanted to stay in what was now Germany or to opt for French citizenship. They chose France, although Alfred's oldest brother Jacques became German in order to hold on to the family's textile mills in Mulhouse. Alfred and his brother Mathieu were sent to boarding school in Paris, and Alfred eventually decided to pursue a career in the French military. This was not such an unusual choice for a young Alsatian Jew at the time. Unlike in Germany, where there were few Jewish officers until World War I, or really for that matter the United States, where there had been some Jewish officers, but not that many really until World War II. The French army, in its attempt to modernize after its stinging loss in the Franco-Prussian War, became largely meritocratic and open to Jews. By the end of the 19th century, France had roughly 300 Jewish officers. Dreyfus he was a great student, and he won admission to the École Polytechnique, which was at the very pinnacle of the French university system and was a training ground for the military officer corps. Although Jews were a tiny minority in France, they represented 0.2% of the French population at the time, so about 80,000 out of 40 million French people. They made up 3 to 4% of the École Polytechnique in the 1880s, or even slightly earlier in the 1870s. Upon graduation in 1880, Dreyfus joined the army and began his rise through the ranks, eventually securing a coveted position on the Army's general staff, the so-called Holy of Holies. That was a plum position. In 1890, the up-and-coming officer married Lucie Adamar from an even more well-integrated French-Jewish family. In the book, I use the term integrated rather than assimilated to refer to the way that the Dreyfus and Adamar families adapted themselves to French culture. And this represents a departure from the way that a previous generation of scholars, including most notably Hannah Arendt, referred to 19th century French Jews. In The Origins of Totalitarianism, which I saw on Ben's bookshelf just now when I was waiting in his office, in that book, Arendt accuses French Jews, including Dreyfus, she specifically singles him out, of leaving behind their Jewish affiliation and sense of solidarity with other Jews in the rush to become French. But I try to argue in the book that that was not actually the case. Dreyfus himself was not a religious person, but his wife Lucy was, and the family was moderately observant. Nominally Orthodox, as I said, like all French Jews. The Reform movement never officially took hold in France. They attended synagogue on major holidays and on the anniversaries of the death of family members. The Jewish Museum in Paris, which I got to work in their archive, which was great, it contains numerous religious artifacts that were preserved by the Dreyfus family and donated to the museum, including Lucy's Hebrew prayer book. There it is. It's a really beautiful object, and you'll see that it has inscribed, written in her hand, the anniversaries of the deaths of family members. So that was a way that they would know, according to the Hebrew calendar, when to say prayers. Alfred and Lucy were married in the main synagogue in Paris by Zadok Khan, France's chief rabbi, who was a friend of the family. All of Alfred's siblings married other Jews, as did both of their children. So to me, anyway, that I think shows that he didn't abandon what today we would call his Jewish identity, even as he became a French military officer. So that's one of the arguments I make in the book. I try to, look at what Jewishness meant for him, and I show that he really, definitely did not assimilate, if what we mean by assimilation means giving up your Jewish identity. It's important to note that the very specific form of Jewish identity that took shape over the course of the 19th century in France, so-called Franco-Judaism, did not view the process of becoming French as a zero-sum game for Jews. Indeed, for the generation of Jews who integrated into French culture in the 19th century, Frenchness and Jewishness went hand in hand. And that's because the France that Dreyfus and others like him loved and yearned to be part of was the France of the French Revolution, the France that had declared its fidelity to universalist values by granting the Jews and other minorities full civil rights. As Jews, they felt doubly French because it had been their emancipation that had helped define the new kind of nation that France had become. Now, this model of the nation was called into question by the dramatic rise in anti-Semitism that began in France really in the 1880s. France has always posed a conundrum for scholars of anti-Semitism, that the European country that showed the most openness to Jews was also the country where the new racist form of anti-Semitism really first took shape. But what seems like a paradox is not actually one, since modern anti-Semitism developed in direct reaction to the openness shown towards Jews. It was the new visibility of Jews in high-profile arenas in France, in business, the arts, and especially in the Republican state apparatus, including the military, in the late 19th century, that made them targets both for nationalists on the right and for a certain strain of socialists on the left. Not maybe totally dissimilar from what we're experiencing now. I can come back to that in the question period. By the 1880s, France was increasingly divided between two competing visions of its past and its future. One was progress-oriented. It welcomed the changes brought about by the French Revolution, the political, economic, and social liberalism that had triumphed by the end of the 19th century. The other was disgruntled and nostalgic. Some in this anti-modern camp yearned for a return to the old feudal order and for a society rooted in conservative religious values. This reactionary faction found adherents primarily among the segments of society that had been left behind by modern capitalism, impoverished aristocrats, fundamentalist Catholics, insecure shopkeepers, and some segments of the rural peasantry. By the 1880s, this association of those left behind, increasingly expressed its frustration with modernity through anti-Semitism. One of the first to sense the potential of anti-Semitism to galvanize the disaffected segments of French society was the journalist Édouard Drumont, and there he is. He published a 1,000-page screed entitled La France Juive, Jewish France, in 1886. Drumont's book blamed Jews for all the ills of the modern world, and it became a runaway bestseller. Hitler would later take it as a model. Capitalizing on his success, Drumont launched a daily anti-Semitic newspaper in 1892. Which devoted itself to denouncing the role of Jews in all arenas of French national life. Aided by horrific illustrations, it perfected the kind of racialized caricature of the greedy, rapacious Jew that would become a staple in later Nazi propaganda, as in this image where a grotesque Jewish figure is shown clutching a globe. The caption reads, "Their homeland." The implication being the Jews were too cosmopolitan to ever really be French. Now, one of Drumont's favorite targets was the presence of Jews in the French military, which his newspaper began denouncing in a scathing series of articles in 1892 that accused all Jews of being potential traitors to the nation. It therefore came as no surprise that when in late 1894, the French military discovered that there actually was a traitor in its midst, suspicion fell on Dreyfus, a Jew. Was anti-Semitism the only reason that Dreyfus was suspected? Not exactly, but as I'll try to explain now, it was the critical reason. So, Dreyfus had experienced relatively little anti-Semitism during his training period in the military. There was one incident when he was in officer training school when one of his teachers, who had openly declared that he didn't like Jews, gave Dreyfus a nearly perfect grade for technical accomplishment and a 0 for the more subjective character assessment. The only other Jewish student in the class received a similar low grade. Dreyfus lodged a formal complaint with the head of the school and was told that since it wouldn't affect his overall standing, which still entitled him to a coveted spot as an intern on the Army's general staff, he should let the matter drop, and he did. But if anti-Semitism was not a major force in the Army as a whole, it did make itself felt on the general staff once Dreyfus got to the so-called Holy of Holies, where he was the only Jew and where he was disliked by many of his superiors. At his trial, they would cite various reasons for their antipathy. His reserved manner inspired distrust, and his large fortune inspired envy. So Dreyfus, from his family, had a personal income of 40,000 francs a year at a time when the salary for a junior officer was 2,000 francs a year. So, he lived much better than any of his, colleagues. He had, a nice apartment and a horse and things like that. His reserved manner inspired distrust and his large fortune inspired envy. But clearly anti-Semitism was also at work. And probably not totally, separated from that envy at his wealth. In the 1880s and 90s, the army's top leadership was divided between an old guard that remained attached to aristocratic traditions that had all come up from this one military academy called Saint-Cyr, and an up-and-coming group of modernizers, many of whom went to the École Polytechnique like Dreyfus, who sought a technocratic overhaul of the army's leadership and operations. Although not all the modernizers were Jews, all the Jews, including Dreyfus, were modernizers. So whether Dreyfus was hated by his superiors on the general staff because he was Jewish or because he was a modernizer, it seems clear that without powerful protectors, family connections, or the leadership qualities valued by the traditionalists, he probably would have been denied a permanent position on the general staff despite his technical brilliance, even had he never been charged with treason. So some of his superiors were clearly determined to block his path. But does that mean he was accused of treason because he was Jewish? That's one of the central questions of the affair, and it's given rise to a great deal of debate among historians. Of course, we can't ever really know the motivations of Dreyfus's accusers with certainty. But the events leading up to his arrest suggest that Dreyfus's Jewishness played a major role in the accusation and the case. These events began with the discovery of the document known as the bordereau. There it is. In late September 1894. Which was intercepted by French counterintelligence and indicated that someone in the French army was selling secrets to the Germans. I'll just interrupt myself here because it's actually a great story that I tell in the book about how this document came into the hands of French counterintelligence. So they had the French had a spy in the German embassy, and that was the cleaning lady. She was illiterate, so the German military attaché thought that there would be no risk. He would just barely tear up documents and throw them in the trash bin, and then she would collect it and bring it to the French counterintelligence, who would paste it back together. So. The information contained in the document, in the bordereau, was not terribly important, and the discovery might not have turned into an affair had General Auguste Mercier, there he is, not taken an interest in the case. A graduate of the École Polytechnique, Mercier was considered a modernizer, and his appointment as Minister of War, so the top guy in the army, in May 1894, had angered the nationalist far right. Drumont repeatedly attacked him in the pages of his newspaper for being allied with Jews. Mercier believed therefore, that by catching the spy, he could prove his worthiness to the nationalist far right, and he therefore put pressure on his underlings to unmask the bordereau's author as quickly as possible. Soon, the underlings in the counterintelligence office developed a theory, later shown to be erroneous, that the spy had to be an intern on the general staff because only someone who moved between divisions, like interns did, would have had access to the different types of information contained in the bordereau. Furthermore, they reasoned, also erroneously, that given the nature of the information on munitions, the spy probably was an artillery officer. So they looked at the list of artillery officers among the interns on the general staff, and one name stood out: Dreyfus, the only Jewish name on the list. On October 6th, two of the top generals compared the handwriting of the bordereau to that of Dreyfus, and they believed that it matched. Similarities did, in fact, exist. At that time, people were taught penmanship, and everyone kind of wrote in a similar style. But there were also differences. And the expert graphologists who testified at Dreyfus's trial were divided in their conclusions. One of them, the eccentric Alphonse Bertillon, who would later become known for using photography to identify and classify criminals, advanced the theory that Dreyfus had attempted to disguise his own handwriting in the bordereau, which later became known as the self-forgery hypothesis. That the counter-espionage officers were willing to believe such a ridiculous theory suggests, I think, that they were swayed by something else besides the facts of the case, so that they were influenced by anti-Semitism. It seems clear to me that while the military brass did not consider Dreyfus guilty only because he was Jewish, the fact that he was Jewish led them to accept his guilt more easily. In other words, because Dreyfus was a Jew, the officers investigating the case were not surprised that he would have committed treason once they realized that he was an artillery officer on the general staff and when they saw the superficial similarity between his handwriting and that of the document. Indeed, as soon as the colonel in charge of counter-espionage, a known anti-Semite, was informed that Dreyfus was the suspect, he declared, "I should have known," meaning, because he was Jewish. Was anti-Semitism also at play at Dreyfus's brief court-martial in December 1894, where the military judges were shown a secret file with supposedly damning evidence that was kept hidden from Dreyfus's lawyers in clear violation of the law? Once again, the court seems to have been very willing to violate legal procedure and to believe the hypothesis of Dreyfus's guilt based on very flimsy evidence. Dreyfus was found guilty by the court-martial and subjected to a humiliating public degradation ceremony in the courtyard of the École Militaire. So right, if you know Paris, this is right next to the Eiffel Tower, where his insignia were ripped from his uniform and his sword broken as a crowd of 10,000 people screamed, "Death to the traitor, death to Judas." So he was paraded into the courtyard, forced to march all the way around as people were screaming at him. And he, trying to maintain his dignity, just kept shouting, "I am innocent, long live France." In the book, I try to imagine what this must have been like for him. It's really hard, I think, to imagine how painful this ceremony was for someone like Dreyfus, who only ever longed to serve the French nation and who now had been found guilty of betraying it. It's really like the worst thing. He says it's the worst thing he could be accused of doing. Here is a mugshot taken right after that horrible ceremony, which I find very poignant, and I put on the frontispiece to the book, his expression there. Dreyfus's sister protested in a letter to the government that her brother's only crime was having been born a Jew. Dreyfus himself supposedly made a comment to that effect to the prison warden after his arrest. But that was really the only time he made overt reference to anti-Semitism. It's partly, I think, because he, wanted to maintain this kind of dignified front, and I think also to avoid, as I said, fanning the flames of the hatred. His early supporters were also reluctant to emphasize the role played by anti-Semitism in the case. Their goal was to get as many people as possible to believe in his innocence, and they thought that emphasizing universal values, again, like truth and justice, was the way to do it. Then, as now, there was the feeling that anti-Semitism was only an issue that applied to Jews. When the novelist Émile Zola published his incendiary article entitled J'accuse, I accuse, and there it is, in January 1898, which blew the lid off the case by exposing how the Army's top brass including Mercier, the Minister of War, had attempted to frame Dreyfus and protect the actual guilty person, which I'll come to in a minute, Zola barely mentioned the issue of anti-Semitism. But the publication of his article set off a series of anti-Semitic riots that lasted for months. Over 69 French cities and towns, many with no Jews, witnessed anti-Semitic agitation in the spring of 1898. The most violent demonstrations occurred in colonial Algeria, where Jews were beaten and even killed, not by the local Arab population, but by non-Jewish Europeans. By this point, France was divided between Dreyfusards and anti-Dreyfusards. It was really on the verge of civil war. Again, I think another echo with our current moment. And in the book, I tried to understand what was at stake for each group. At first, many of those who opposed Dreyfus did so because they genuinely believed he was guilty. But after the revelation that the bordereau was the work not of Dreyfus, but of a dissolute minor nobleman named Ferdinand Walsen Esterhazy, and there he is, I feel like, Dreyfus was like the least likely person to commit treason. Not only was his family, very wealthy and he didn't need the money, but he was this totally upstanding family man. Whereas this guy, I say in the book, he practically had traitor written across his forehead. I mean, I think he looks like one of those like evil, dastardly villains, but he also was, a addicted gambler with like mistresses, and he would go openly to the German embassy, in broad daylight. After it was revealed that the army was attempting to cover up for Esterhazy, a disturbingly large percentage of the country remained still dedicated to opposing justice for Dreyfus. Why? Some felt that the honor of the army was more important than justice for the individual. So they felt like we're going to have this other war with Germany. It's coming up. It's important to just protect the army at all costs, even if it means that one innocent guy, suffers on Devil's Island. Others merely hated Jews and thought they deserved to be punished, regardless of whether Dreyfus himself, this particular Jew, was guilty. They were fed, it should be said, by increasingly disturbing anti-Semitic propaganda, including a series of posters known as the Museum of Horrors, which caricatured leading Dreyfusards and other Jews as animals. So there is actually one of the series of Dreyfus being lynched, and then another one of Dreyfus with his head on a serpent. The dehumanization of the Jewish enemy in these posters rivals anything that was seen during the Nazi period. The next major break in the case, after discovering who was the real traitor, came when it was revealed that much of the evidence against Dreyfus had been forged, and when the forger, Commandant Hubert Joseph Henry, slit his own throat in prison. Finally possessing the definitive proof they needed that Dreyfus had been framed, his family was able to file a petition to overturn the verdict. Drumont, meanwhile, the anti-Semite, took up a collection for the forger Henri's widow in the pages of his newspaper. Thousands of people contributed to the fund, often attaching violently anti-Semitic messages to their donations. "Long live the saber that will rid us of the vermin," one wrote. "A patriot awaiting the saber to avenge us. For God, for country, and for the extermination of the Jews." One contributor gave 25 centimes to, quote, rent a deportation car. Although the scholar Stephen Wilson, one of the few to focus on the question of anti-Semitism during the affair, argues that the violence expressed in the Henri donations remained purely symbolic, it seems clear to me that it unleashed the imagination of genocide, if not its actual implementation. While half of France went down a very dark path during the affair, the good news is that the other half of France came to the defense of the Jewish officer. The modern use of the term intellectual to describe cultural figures who take a stand on political issues dates to this moment, as thousands of writers, teachers, and artists spoke out in favor of Dreyfus. The Dreyfusards formed the Human Rights League and other organizations to defend democratic values, which they thought were under threat by anti-Semitism. Meanwhile, on Devil's Island, Dreyfus had no idea of the campaign being waged on his behalf. Almost completely cut off from the outside world, except for a slow trickle of letters that arrived heavily censored by the authorities, the prisoner engaged in a daily struggle for survival. Watched day and night by guards who did not speak a word to him, he felt profoundly alone, abandoned. Days were spent gathering wood to cook his meals before the blazing heat drove him inside his tiny hut, where he spent most of his time writing letters and reading a range of books, including mathematical treatises and novels by Balzac and others. He even learned English to read Shakespeare in the original. So he's often dismissed as, a not very intellectual person, but that's really the opposite of the case. The long nights on Devil's Island were the worst. In order to prevent his escape, the guards began, and escape would have been impossible. It was like this shark-infested, waters surrounding this remote island. But the guards began chaining him to his bed at night so that he couldn't move, even as bugs, like tropical insects, crawled all over his body, attracted by the light that they shone on him at all times. He wrote in his journal that his desire to clear his name for the sake of his wife and family was the only thing that kept him alive during his 5 years of torment. While some historians have seen Dreyfus as incidental to the affair that bears his name, since he was outside of France as the fight to free him took place, it was really only thanks to his extraordinary will to survive that justice eventually triumphed. The historian Vincent Duclerc rightly, I think, sees Dreyfus as a model of resistance to the totalitarian regimes that would mark the 20th century. Eventually, as evidence of his innocence emerged, the army was indeed forced to throw out the earlier judgment against Dreyfus and to bring him back from Devil's Island for a second trial. While the first court-martial lasted only 3 days, the second one played out over the course of several weeks in August and September 1899, and it was covered on the front pages of newspapers throughout the world. The American press was particularly interested in the case and was almost uniformly pro-Dreyfus, which may come as a surprise given the level of nativist, racist, and anti-Semitic sentiment that prevailed in the US at the time. In their articles about the case, leading writers like Mark Twain took pains to underscore the dangers that right-wing nationalism and anti-Semitism posed for American democracy. Stick thin, his hair turned white even though he was only 39 years old, Dreyfus did his best to respond to hostile questions at the second trial. However, his voice, which had become hoarse from years of not speaking, and his reticent demeanor did not endear him to the judges or the public. Despite his evident innocence, the military court found him guilty once again, albeit this time with extenuating circumstances. How there could be extenuating circumstances when it came to treason, the court didn't say, but the French government now realized it had to act to prevent an international outcry and possibly a boycott of the 1900 Paris World's Fair because of the case. So the president of the French Republic offered Dreyfus a pardon. Although his most hardline defenders urged Dreyfus to refuse the pardon, he eventually accepted it on the condition he could still fight to clear his name. You know, he couldn't go back to Devil's Island. He really had no choice. So he was reunited with his family shortly after, but it took until 1906 until he was completely exonerated by French courts, reinstated in the army, and awarded the Legion of Honor. He lived out most of the rest of his life quietly, although his name remained a battle line in the ongoing war between right-wing nationalists and liberal universalists, a war that in many ways has never ended in France. And in fact, the case continues to arouse passions in France. During the last presidential election, the right-wing candidate Éric Zemmour made headlines by claiming that Dreyfus's innocence was, quote, not obvious. The fact that Zemmour himself is Jewish only adds to the strangeness of that provocation. I think that what was going on is that Zemmour was trying to, it was like a dog whistle to the far right saying, even though I'm Jewish, I'm actually one of you, and he used Dreyfus to do that. Dreyfus came out of retirement to fight in World War I. His son also fought in like every major battle, and his nephew was killed in the war. Dreyfus himself died in 1935, shortly after Hitler came to power in Germany. The Dreyfus family was not spared the horror of the Holocaust. Lucy Dreyfus, his wife, now an old woman, was forced to hide in a convent under an assumed name, and Dreyfus's favorite granddaughter, Madeleine, a resistance fighter, was murdered in Auschwitz. Here's a picture I took of the Dreyfus family grave in the Jewish section of Montparnasse Cemetery, right in the center of Paris, that has the names in order of death. So Alfred right at the top, Madeleine underneath him, and underneath her name it says, deported by the Germans, disappeared at Auschwitz at the age of 25. Chapter 6 of my book explores the effect of Dreyfus's life on the lives of Jews around the world. Of course, and this is really I think where I do the most original research in the book. I tried to spend some time thinking, like, what can I say that's, besides having a new take on it, like, what actual research can I contribute? And this is where I found to do it. Of course, non-Jews were passionately interested in the case as well. But for Jews, the affair was an obsession. From London to Sydney, from St. Petersburg to Cincinnati, Jewish readers devoured dispatches from Devil's Island, interviews with Dreyfus's wife, and accounts of his legal maneuvers in Jewish newspapers that often seemed to report on little else. So I read the main newspapers in English and French and had research assistants help me with the Hebrew, Yiddish, and German newspapers. What I discovered was that the affair served as a kind of turning point or catalyst for the three main Jewish political ideologies at the time. So Zionism, which called for Jews to form their own nation in Palestine, what we might call integrationism, which believed that Jews should be loyal citizens to the countries of their birth, and socialism, which called for the solidarity of the working class beyond national, religious, or ethnic borders. These ideologies were in fierce conflict at the end of the 19th century, during the years the Dreyfus Affair played out. It's striking that the proponents of the three major ideologies all found in the Dreyfus Affair confirmation of their vision of the Jewish future, despite the fact that their ideologies were in many ways diametrically opposed. This was because of the complexity of the affair and its many different phases. So the integrationists could fixate on Dreyfus's exoneration as the ultimate validation for their worldview, conveniently forgetting the anti-Semitic riots that preceded it. The Zionists could do the reverse, focusing on the outpouring of anti-Semitism, which seemed to prove that Jews could never be safe without a country of their own. And socialists could see in the affair the need for a specifically Jewish form of working-class solidarity. The affair seemed to clarify, but also to harden their ideological positions and to draw battle lines before the Holocaust and the creation of the State of Israel rendered prior answers to the so-called Jewish question obsolete. I'm drawing to the conclusion here. It could also be argued, though, that the affair brought out not just differences, but also a fundamental similarity in the way that Jews viewed themselves and their world. I show in the book that the Dreyfus Affair was one of the defining moments when a new modern form of Jewish identity emerged. Prior to the 19th century, Jews felt linked to other Jews throughout the world, but these ties were mainly religious, the experience of participating in the same rituals or being bound by the same laws, or they were national, being part of an ancient nation now dispersed. In the 19th century, such bonds melted away for many Jews as secularism took hold and Jews began to feel a part of the countries in which they lived. But the old bonds were replaced by a new unifying force, the memory of and ongoing fear of anti-Semitic persecution. This was what came to define Jewish identity for modern Jews. It arguably remains the common denominator constituting Jewish identity today. The Dreyfus Affair represents one of the key moments when this new identity took shape. Along with a series of earlier anti-Semitic crises, such as the Russian pogroms, the affair reminded Jews of their belonging to a people with a painful history. The affair tapped into a shared understanding of the difficulties Jews faced in the past, and as a result, inspired them to feel a sense of solidarity with other Jews in the present. Turn-of-the-century Jews may have disagreed about almost everything having to do with Jewish life, from how to worship to the need for a Jewish state. But they could come together in shared sorrow as they read about the plight of the prisoner of Devil's Island, and they could rejoice together as the vindicated Jewish officer received the Legion of Honor. I argue in my book that it was in the collective experience of the affair that a new Jewish sense of community took shape beyond national, ideological, or religious borders. Thank you.
So I don't recall if you answered this, but what actually happened to the actual traitor in the French military?
Yeah. So what happened? The question is, what happened to Esterhazy, the villain? Yeah. So he got away with it, basically. So he fled to England, and he'd been protected by the French army. And then when he got wind that he was actually brought to trial first, but found innocent. And even though there was overwhelming evidence against him. So at that point he stayed in France, but then when he felt like everyone was, turning against him, he fled to England, and he lived out the rest of his life there. He would periodically write, give interviews for money, about the affair, but he, stayed up to no good, but he got away with it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. So my name's Anish, and I had a question about the integrationists, I think you called them.
Yeah.
So I just was more interested in what kind of happens to them, or what other situations or events throughout history were they in support of, or did they use as support, and how did that kind of interact with the Zionist movement?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So it's important to keep in mind that Zionism was created by Theodor Herzl around 1897. He would claim later that he had the idea for Zionism watching the degradation of Dreyfus. So he was a reporter for a German language newspaper, and he claimed that's when he had the idea. Although that turns out not to really be true. He had the idea slightly before, but it made a good story for him. And it's definitely true that he used the Dreyfus Affair to drum up support for Zionism, saying, if this could even happen in France, then Jews weren't safe anywhere. So it's important to keep in mind that the Jewish establishment at that time was opposed to Zionism. So, the kind of well-integrated Jews in Western Europe and the United States were, really kind of horrified by this idea that, there were these people saying Jews should all move to Palestine, partly because they thought it was, confirming what anti-Semites were saying, which was that Jews didn't belong in the countries where, they were. So they really opposed Zionism. And, they were constantly being tested by other anti-Semitic incidents. So the Dreyfus Affair being a big one, but another big one was the Kishinev pogrom, which happened slightly later, which was, huge international, news, and, these Jews were just like slaughtered in the street in kind of Ukraine, Romania. And for the integrationists, and we see this in the way they talk about the Dreyfus Affair too. They say, that especially this is true, I would say, of the American and British integrationists. They say, that happens in Europe, but this could never, Anglo-American institutions would never allow this to take place. So it's like, or maybe they would say like, Zionism is fine for like Jews in like, the Russian Empire where they have no rights. But, in Western European Jews would never need that. And interestingly, towards the end of his life, Dreyfus gave an interview with Herzl's newspaper, Die Welt, which Herzl would later claim that, look, Dreyfus is now a Zionist. But if you read it closely, he's not actually saying that. What he does say is, it's, that could be a solution for Jews, suffering in, without rights in Eastern Europe, but it's not, clearly not what he felt would be a solution for French Jews.
So why Devil's Island? Why with all the anti-Semitism and all the people calling for Jewish death and demise, why not the death penalty and instead just banishment to some far-off corner?
Very good question. So they had outlawed the death penalty for political crimes. So that, a lot of people were like, calling for his death, but they couldn't do that. So most political prisoners at the time were sent to the French colony of New Caledonia, kind of near, Australia. And political prisoners were allowed to bring their families with them there. They created a regime of exception for Dreyfus. So he was the only prisoner on Devil's Island. So it was this group of islands that had a prison system. And if you've ever seen, if you're interested, there's a great Steve McQueen movie called Papillon, which it's really worth seeing. It takes place slightly later, but that's set in that prison system. But Devil's Island had been a leper colony that was cleared of the lepers for Dreyfus, and they wanted him there because they thought it was impossible to escape from. So it was, as I said, like shark-infested waters and like very remote. So.
Hi, thank you for a really interesting lecture. You alluded to at some point in the lecture that you welcomed a question about kind of any kind of analogies to today in terms of some of the your findings and analysis. I was just curious, what those would be. Yeah.
Yeah. I've thought a lot about it. I wrote the book before October 7th. So, I get a lot of questions about, does this show that, what does this tell us about, the enduring nature of anti-Semitism? I think it shows some things. I don't think that the parallels are perfect, but there was anti-Semitism at the time on both the left and the right. The kind of anti-Semitism that really targeted Dreyfus, though, during the affair was right-wing anti-Semitism, like the kind of Jews don't belong in this country because they're a different race. That was the brand of kind of racist, right-wing, nationalist, xenophobic anti-Semitism, that we see in the case. Interestingly, the far left, the far left had like a long tradition of anti-Semitism that, associated Jews with capitalism. But what's really interesting is that during the affair, at first the Socialist Party remains neutral. Like they don't take a stance in favor of Dreyfus because they think, oh, he's a bourgeois guy. He's a, upper middle class and, an army officer. He can take care of himself. It's not an issue for the working class. But interestingly, the socialist politician Jean Jaurès changes that. And he says, actually, the suffering of an innocent man is a socialist concern. And so it's really thanks to Jaurès, I think, that a large section of the left in France becomes anti-Semitic. So the case becomes really a defining moment where the camps of left and right really kind of take shape around this issue and around the issue of anti-Semitism. I think that we're seeing, obviously a parallel now is that anti-Semitism is a political football that's being used, for various political purposes, I would say now, and in a similar way to back then. But really the issue that was on my mind as I wrote the book was about political polarization. So that's what I was really thinking of. Like, how does a country on the verge of civil war over ideological issues ever come back from that? Like, what do you do? And, France was really as close to civil war over this issue. In fact, I have another slide here. Yeah. So this is a famous cartoon from the time that says, so a family dinner, and it's 1898, so it's the height of the affair, so everyone's talking, and it says here, and the caption said for the top is, whatever we do, let's not talk about the Dreyfus Affair. And then the caption, which you can't see of the bottom one, is they talked about it. So, famously, the affair divided France, but it also divided families. The family of the writer Marcel Proust was divided by, it divided the Impressionist painters, for example. Half were pro-Dreyfus, half against. And, the country, it was really bitter for a couple years. And I have thought about in the book, like, what was it that got France out of it? And partly it was the kind of political maneuvering of the president of the Republic, who decided that the only way forward was to have a government of Republican defense, he called it. So it was a kind of centrist government, but with ministers on both sides, anti and pro Dreyfus, who he could bring together. And this was something that the parliamentary system made possible, I think. So he was able to bring together these people. And that, they decided to have a kind of compromise, which was they gave a pardon to Dreyfus, but they also pardoned everyone involved in the affair. So all of those kind of, evildoers in the top army brass got a total pass, which enraged the far left of, France. But it did quiet things down in France. And so, the tension dissipated a little bit. The left wound up getting its revenge, though, because it did come to power afterwards, and that's what led to the separation of church and state in France. So they wanted to punish the Catholic Church, which they felt had been against Dreyfus, and so they pushed through that separation. So anyway, that's a long answer to one of the parallels.
So I'm wondering if you might say a bit more about the anti-modernism that undergirds this form of anti-Semitism. I'm intrigued by the fact that he is a graduate of l'École Polytechnique. He's an artillery officer. In many ways, he represents the new France, but also the new kind of warfare that is a reality, particularly after the shame of defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. And then he serves in Verdun, which is sort of the effigy of a modernist kind of warfare. So how do you read that? Is it because it's a newly or aspirational meritocratic army that he represents, in which Jews could conceivably succeed, and that threatens officers trained in a different fashion?
Yeah, and I should say that I'm not the first one to argue that. So that's actually largely the argument of the great Dreyfus historian in France, Vincent Duclerc, argues that. But he really does it by saying that therefore anti-Semitism wasn't that important. Mm-hmm. Whereas I kind of think they were actually linked. That that anti-modernism and anti-Semitism. And in fact, I think that anti-modernism in general, not just in military terms, underlies a lot of the anti-Semitism in the 19th century in France. That it's really a reaction to all of the changes, economic, political, social, that were inaugurated by the French Revolution. And that Jews were seen as the main beneficiaries of. And, to some extent they were. Jews before the French Revolution were this very isolated, mostly impoverished group that lived in, small rural villages because they weren't allowed to live in large towns and cities. They weren't allowed to participate in the economy. They mostly didn't speak French. They were really, marginal. And then within, they get full citizenship in 1790-91 and then flourish within a generation. They are now in very visible positions, in the economy, but also in the arts and also in the government. And that, I think, becomes a lightning rod for all of those groups who were left behind. So who were, doing well before, or, at least perceived themselves as having done better before the French Revolution. So Drummond, the anti-Semite I talked about in his book, La France Juive, it opens by saying the only ones who benefited from the revolution were the Jews, which is a pretty crazy thing to say, since the Jews were 0.2% of the French population. It was crazy, but that I think says it all.
So I was just wondering, when Dreyfus was exiled to Devil's Island,
Yeah.
What happened with his family, with his wife, with any of them? Were they sent to New Caledonia? Were they just did they remain in France? Were they attacked, assaulted, whatever?
Yeah, great question. So his wife, when they thought he would be sent to New Caledonia, was willing to go with him and wanted to go with him. they said no. In fact, he had to go alone. So his wife stays. She's at first told, when they go to arrest him, you can't tell anyone. They didn't tell her what he was arrested for. She had to keep it a total secret. Finally, she was allowed to tell his brother, who came, his brother Mathieu, the next oldest brother. And the two of them basically set out to prove his innocence. And they are real heroes in the affair. And it was really hard, because at the beginning, they were like, you know, we know he's innocent, but how do you prove that someone didn't do something? You know, it's really hard to prove. And so they also don't want to attract too much attention, is the other thing, because they don't want it to seem like they're just throwing their money around. They wind up spending a huge amount of money, like 1 million francs. They slowly, you know, discover proof of the real traitor, Esterhazy, and then, you know, other things kind of leak out. But their main goal is to get important people on their side. So to interest like prominent intellectuals, and like they get the head of the Senate on their side, which is a big one. And then obviously when they get the novelist Émile Zola, that's a really big one. So, but that takes several years, and they, you know, are really in despair. And Lucy is like a really remarkable person, because she was only like 25 years old. She had had this very sheltered life, and all of a sudden she's forced to rise to the occasion. And she also is really responsible for keeping Dreyfus alive, like keeping his spirits up. And she writes him these amazing letters that were later published that are, you know, just really moving to read.
I also like noticed in the previous picture, it might be for no reason, but like there's a bunch of rocks on the grave. Is that for a reason?
So that's a Jewish mourning practice. So Jews, you traditionally don't bring flowers. You put a rock to show that you have, you know, are thinking of the person and have been there. So this is actually, I think, the only mistake I make in the book, which is that I say in the book that nothing about the tomb shows their Jewishness except for those rocks. But as someone pointed out, actually the son and grandson, which I can talk about in a minute, or sorry, the grandson and great-grandson of Dreyfus, I didn't notice that there are 2 Hebrew letters at the top that basically mean like "here lies" in Hebrew. It's like an acronym. So otherwise, I think it's a very French Republican tomb that's very much like we are French. And, you know, there's many Jewish tombs do have, you know, Hebrew names in Hebrew or other, you know, little prayers in Hebrew. There's only that little one. But I think it's really interesting that people have placed rocks on the tomb. So it's like the tomb is being reappropriated for Jewish memory. And Dreyfus himself, whether that was, you know, he would have wanted that or not, you know, that's what's happened. I'll just say about his, the family. So, you know, I knew that there are descendants around, but I, on purpose, didn't really want to talk to them, because you wind up you feel bad if you say something that they don't like, and then you feel sort of beholden to them when you're writing a biography, so I didn't go that route. But when the book came out, I was giving a talk at the Jewish Museum in New York, afterwards, it turned out there were 2 descendants in the audience. So his great-grandson and his great-great-granddaughter from 2 different branches. So Dreyfus had 2 children. So the great-grandson was from his son's family, and then the great-great-granddaughter was from the daughter's family. So they were like 2nd or 3rd cousins. And so the great-grandson, whose name is Dreyfus, invited me to meet his father in Paris that summer, who was 97. So now he's probably 98, I guess, or 99 almost. And he was an amazing person. So I spent an afternoon with him. And he felt like I got it right, which was good. He pointed out that the Hebrew letter on the tomb. I also said one other thing in the book, which is, so on Devil's Island, Dreyfus was basically not given any food at the beginning. He was given unroasted coffee berries and like tins of preserved pork, like preserved lard, basically, like bacon. And he would throw the bacon into the sea, like he didn't eat it. And I say in the book, I say perhaps, this was out of a, kind of, fidelity to Jewish, practices of not eating pork. And the grandson said no, that he wouldn't have cared about that at all. It was just gross. He didn't want to eat it. So, but that one I had hedged. So this was an actual mistake. But anyway, it was very interesting. So I met both sides of the family. I would say they're politically very different now. The one side was, I would say, more kind of left-leaning. The other one kind of more right-leaning now, which is interesting. They were both, sides were still Jewish. Part of the family lives in Israel now, too, which is, I found interesting. And they were, very, so the grandson, the 97-year-old, had grown up in New York because the family had to flee during World War II, and they fled to New York. So he had gone to like Stuyvesant High School, which was kind of funny. Anyway, yeah.
Is your hand up? Oh. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the years leading up to the affair. Yeah. You mentioned Drumont, you mentioned the rise of this kind of virulent, it was enough to sustain a daily newspaper. What was the rest of France doing? Were they responding? Was it a topic of discussion, or was it just kept quiet? What were Jewish people doing?
Yeah, so, the anti-Semitic movement, really enlisted a lot of people. And that was, I think, Drumont's, claim to fame, as it were, is that he realized that was a deep vein that he could tap into. That is fascinating still, that he was able to figure that out, that there was that much resentment brewing, and that could be something that would unite kind of left and right in France. But, a lot of French, I would say, people have tried to estimate like what percentage of France became anti-Semitic, and there are various, it's hard to say, which segments, but it was never all of France. It was never even half of France. So, but it doesn't take that many people to really have like a horrible horrible things happen, and so this period, the affair, is really interesting because it both brings to the surface all of this anti-Semitism, which in some ways foreshadows what's going to happen later during the Holocaust in France, but in other ways it also forces the left to come up with these new institutions like the Human Rights League that will be put in place to oppose anti-Semitism. So I say in the book that if you had asked someone in 1899, if you had said to someone like, there's going to be a Holocaust in 40 years, where do you think it'll happen? People would have said France. Like that it was the most anti-Semitic place, much more than Germany. But it didn't start in France. It did happen in France too, but it partly didn't, I think, I try to argue, because of this case. So because the left was able to put some barriers. Yeah.
Thanks. It was actually a perfect introduction to or lead into my question. Was so, really from 1906, when Dreyfus is finally fully exonerated to the rise of Hitler, you're talking about like less than 20 years, right?
Yeah.
And so the question I have is, as this is all going on in France in the late 1890s, what is going on in Germany? Because, you know, the Jews at the time in Germany had felt integrated as well into German society.
Yeah. Well, you know, there are some similarities. You know, the German Jews were also very well integrated. You know, at this time, many of them, you know, had fought in World War I and were, you know, felt very, very German. The big difference is that, you know, Germany loses World War I, and that creates this, in the same way I think that France had this national trauma after 1870, after the Franco-Prussian War. Germany had that after World War I. And in the same way, they knew there was going to be another war. There was the stab in the back theory that they had been betrayed, and it was, you know, betrayed by Jews. And also their economy was totally destroyed and had, you know, massive inflation. And that winds up, you know, getting blamed on Jews also. So, you know, those are some of the things I think that, you know, are why it happened in Germany. Okay, thank you.